Patrick Henry, thank you for your super chat. Is the idea of a zealot Jesus similar to saying that there was a historical Robin Hood, but he stole from the poor and gave to the rich? Can such an individual really be called the historical Jesus?
There. Y'all blanked out on me there for about 30
Okay, I'll
seconds.
repeat what the super chat says. Patrick Henry says, is the idea of a zealot Jesus similar to saying that there was a historical Robin Hood, but he stole from the poor and gave to the rich? Can such an individual really be called the historical Jesus?
I'm not sure I'm getting the Robin Hood connection. How would he rob from the poor and give to? I don't quite get that. If Jesus were okay, several things. One is
Oh, now Dr. Ehrman froze.
Yeah, he froze again.
Let's see if we can get him back.
Yeah.
In the Gospels, Jesus tells the rich young man to sell his property and give it to the poor. The poor are the ones we're supposed to be helping.
Yeah.
Oh, I think we got Dr. Ehrman back.
You got me back. I'm sorry. It looks like our internet's going crazy here. So,
That's okay.
zealot is a term used by Josephus to refer to rebels during the Jewish uprising in 66 to 73. And so it wouldn't be applicable. The technical term wouldn't apply to Jesus. The question is he like one of those who wants to overthrow the Romans through military force? That, of course, is the argument of Reza Aslan in his book Zealot. Reza didn't come up with that idea. It is the oldest idea of the historical Jesus in critical scholarship. It was first pronounced by Hermann Samuel Reimarus in his posthumous work published in the 1770s. And so Reza doesn't acknowledge that, but it's a view that's been around for a long time. And so the question is, did Jesus believe in a violent overthrow of the Roman government? If he did, then it wouldn't be robbing from the poor to give to the rich. It would be taking back what is theirs, taking back the land from the Romans. I don't think it's at all likely that that's what Jesus was up to. I think, in fact, it's contrary to Jesus' message. I think that Jesus did think there'd be a massive destruction and that the Romans would be wiped out, but it was because God's going to do it. It's not going to be because of a Jewish army. And so I think Jesus was opposed to taking up the sword against the Romans. And that I think he really said things like the one who lives by the sword dies by the sword. And I think that I don't think he supported violent opposition.
What makes you think that? What makes you think, for example, that that element was not later, like the Torah criticism element in Paul was introduced later? I mean, I think
Yeah.
we get the definite impression that he's an apocalyptic preacher for sure, but surely apocalypse was more the genre of these rebels before the war.
Well, it could have been. We don't know really what the religious ideology of the zealots were, apart from they wanted the land back. They
The
thought the land
Romans
was
seem to have thought him a real threat, a threat big enough to crucify.
sometimes, depending on what they were doing. But they weren't crucified for. They weren't. Okay, so let me explain it like this: there are two kinds of Jewish apocalypticists. There are more than two. It's like saying there are two kinds of Protestant. There are two kinds of Jewish apocalypticists. Some think that God is going to intervene soon, and there's going to be a major war, and they're going to be involved in it. You get that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the War Scroll, there's going to be a 40-year war where they take up the sword and they're on the side of God. And it takes them 40 years. I don't know why God's war takes 40 years, but it takes them 40 years, and they win the war. There are other Jewish apocalypticists that were not interested in violence. They thought that God himself was going to overthrow the enemy, and that there was no need to interfere. And so you get both of those things kind of now today, I guess, even still, with people believing the end of the world's coming soon, whether they're going to kind of facilitate it or not. I do think that Jesus was the latter type. I think that he was nonviolent. Part of the reason is because the nonviolence is scattered throughout so many of the sources that it's independently attested all over the place, and it coincides with other teachings of Jesus that seem to be contrary to what the early Christians said. For example, love your enemies. Most Christians are not interested in loving their enemies. So when Jesus says things like love your neighbors yourself, and he defines it as somebody who's a Samaritan, who's the enemy. I don't think so. I'm of the persuasion that Jesus was a proponent of nonviolence, and that he thought that in fact taking up the sword was a show of distrust. God's going to do this. That's how I work it out. So I've written a bit about this, trying to show why I think that these sword sayings and what goes back to Jesus and what doesn't. But it's a judgment. It's a judgment call.
I mean, we're specifically told one of his disciples is called a zealot.
Yeah, but that can't be historical because there weren't zealots yet.
Right. Well, certainly true, but we were also told the disciples are supposed to all have swords. I'm going to try and give the best argument I can here.
Yeah, we're told Jesus walked on the water, and so there are things that some of the early Christians definitely believed in violence, and so I think the way it happened was, I mean, I'll tell you, it's really hard to make these connections, but my view is that what happened was Jesus really said something like, don't take up the sword. You take up the sword, you'll die by the sword. In other words, you're going to get crushed. That ain't the way to go, because he really thought God was going to do it. These sayings about the Son of Man coming, the Son of Man's the one who destroys everything.
Right.
And so there's nothing about an army or anything like that. So I think Jesus really said, don't take up the sword. Take up the sword, you'll die by the sword. I think what ends up happening is that what often happens, it looks like, is that you have a saying that turns into a story to provide the context for the saying. See what I mean? It'd be like, and so I've seen this happen all the time in my own life, where there'll be some like, we had stories about Bruce Metzger, my teacher, and you have these one-liners, and then all of a sudden some stories would crop up that would kind of show the context for these one-liners. And it's like, whoa. And I saw it happen. So I think stuff like that did happen. And scholars since the 1920s have said that happened with Jesus. I think Jesus said, take up the sword, die by the sword. And the narrative that got invented around that is that Jesus came to be arrested, and his disciples pulled out a sword to defend him. And then he says, well, you take out the sword, you die by the sword. And so, I don't think his followers are armed, probably. And I don't think that he was encouraging violence or anything like that.